Hello, Daniel.
Well, hello, everybody.
Hey, everybody, how's everybody doing?
Just dandy.
Hello, everyone.
Speaking for everyone, just fine, thank you.
You look happy, Adam.
I'm a happy dude.
Good to hear. I've been wrestling with recording short videos on PowerPoint and Zoom this afternoon.
How did you figure out you could do it on PowerPoint, Daniel?
There's an app for that, as they say.
There's an app for every freaking thing,
Oh,
but how did you figure it out?
I just in the menu bar, there's a record slideshow in the menu button. I've never used it before, but I don't know if anyone else has either. But if you have, speak up. I'm not quite sure where I guess you have to save it separately. Kind of like save.
The file you sent me worked. I mean, I could see you in the corner and I saw the slide for the
Did they
rest.
progress?
Huh?
Did the slides progress?
Oh, there's more than one?
Well, there's one slide, but there's 3 bullet points and the image.
The answer is there was no progression. It was just a static slide with you in the lower right.
Were all the bullet points on it? Or?
I have to look again. I was busy listening to you.
Hey, Daniel, this is Stephanie. My intern put together, well, she's actually a full-time employee now, but when she was my intern, put together a pretty detailed Word document with directions on how to do that, because we used that for our Interopathon event back in the spring. I'm happy to send that to you if it'll help.
Bless your soul, yes. It's one of those Microsoft. I would greatly appreciate that. I think we'd all, as you get more video requests. It's like all Microsoft stuff. Like it's almost there, but it's not completely there.
Yep. Yeah, I'm actually driving right now, but if you shoot me a reminder, I'll send it either later tonight or first thing in the morning.
Perfect.
That's great.
I'll send it to you right now, Steph.
Great, thank you.
Great. I will just give it another minute or so for people to arrive. So what's been happening? Anybody have any good vacation stories in the next minute or two? Nobody's on vacation.
Stephanie and I had a mean breakfast in Vegas.
Oh, right.
We did.
Oh, man.
All you can eat buffet, Jim?
No, unfortunately not. But we picked this place out that did breakfast where, they serve you a platter of stuff and saucer-sized biscuits.
Right. Vegas has gone, I haven't been there in years, but it's gone from a place where you could, practically get a free room, get free food as long as you gambled some, to, high-end chefs and, $100 plates.
Yeah, the cost of being there and eating there is significantly expensive, irregardless of whether you're gambling or not.
Yeah.
I'm curious how busy it was. I know the last time I was at HIMSS was in Las Vegas, and it was ridiculous how many people were there.
So final attendance, I guess, was like somewhere between 10 and 15,000. And Steph,
Pretty impressive.
Your thoughts? Yeah, I'd say about 25% of normal. The other thing is, it was August, so I don't know what August attendance in Vegas is supposed to be like. I guess if anything, as a comment, I did find it kind of shocking to see the number of people that brought their kids. I mean, there are things to do for sure, but Vegas to me just really isn't a kid's destination. And there were lots of kids and lots of strollers. But the town itself, I mean, things were busy. And there were lots of venues we were at that if you didn't have a reservation ahead of time, you weren't getting in.
Wow.
I wondered about that.
I remember a decade and a half ago, Vegas tried to make it a kid-friendly destination. I don't think it ever accomplished mission.
Yeah, it's not terribly unfriendly. It's just, I mean, and we're past the point of children. It was just my wife and myself, but I'm not sure what I would have done, you know, other than splash around the pool, which I could do anywhere. What I would have done to fill up my day with the kids in terms of, you know, things to do, places to go per se.
Blackjack, slots.
Yeah.
Yeah. Come here, kid. Let me show you a 3-card monster.
Circus.
Yeah.
When my daughter was, as I've mentioned probably many times, probably more than appropriate, that she's a gymnast. One of her meets was in Las Vegas. It was a level 10 meet, but she was only in 7th grade. We had a lot of explaining to do after that meet.
Nah.
Yeah.
A lot of explaining to do after that meet because we were there for 4 days.
I can imagine the conversations.
Yeah, that was a very enlightening experience for both of us.
Has she been back?
Oh, hell no.
Hmm.
No more meet. We haven't had any more meets in Las Vegas. I think the coaches were just as distraught as we were because at that time they traveled with their coaches. They didn't travel with us. So the coaches were stuck with the initial questions. We just had the follow-up on the, you know, when they got home. A lot of explaining to do.
Maybe Stephanie, do they have a like a one-pager on that as well? how to describe? Him should pass that out, right? Along with your
Right.
Right?
package. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Exactly.
That's funny. All right, I think we have a more than a quorum here, so we ought to get started. We have a couple new people on the call, and thanks everybody for coming back here. We have a couple of topics. The featured show today is Jim, and he's going to be sharing with us a bunch of material that'll both is relevant for the scan and in general our interoperability efforts. So thanks, Jim, in advance for that. We just have a few announcements and just a few opening comments, or just a few welcoming actually for a couple of new people on the call here, I think. The first person is Nancy Lush. Nancy, would you just welcome, say a few words about where you're from? We had a conversation a couple weeks ago about the work she's doing, and again, the relevance and applicability to overall the consent work and the scan in general. So welcome.
So hello, it's nice to meet you all. I'm Nancy Lush from Patient Centric Solutions, and we have a product which focuses on patient-mediated exchange. It's based on the HART and UMA standards. UMA stands for User Managed Access. And in this scenario, the patient creates the consents, and as a result of that, we dynamically share the data at a granular level. So I could tell you a lot more about that, but we've been working in this consent area for quite a number of years. We've been on all work groups on HART and UMA, and generally, playing in the space. So very nice to meet you all.
That's great. I know we're trying to find some time to actually have you present to the group and share it. It was really fascinating what I've learned about it in the short time we had a chance to talk. So thanks for that. And I know we're planning on trying to schedule some time to talk with you as well. So, Kay, I'm trying to remember. I don't know if you've joined our group before in this particular forum or not, but welcome. I know you're in a new position, even if you haven't been. Yeah, so welcome.
Thank you. I was able to come to one other call. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to be on since then, and I don't think you were on that one. Okay. And so we missed each other. It was fascinating. It was great stuff. Yes, I'm the new executive director at the Kantara Initiative. And Kantara works on lots of standards-based processes and has an assurance program where we certify products and companies who meet NIST 863.3 standards, do a lot of work with the UMA. But I am very new, so I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as many of our members and many of our work group members. So Nancy, I'm sure, can speak to all these things that I probably can't. But anyway, I'm excited to be a part of this, and I'm excited for the work. And I was surprised because Daniel and I have met in other areas of work, and so I was really pleasantly surprised that you were also doing work in this space, because it's really needed. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised that Stewards of Change would be working in all kinds of other places, but this is terrific, and I appreciate you including me, and I hope that over time I'll be able to contribute. Thanks.
Good. Just as a tiny bit of background, Kate joined us when we did a series of focus groups and webinars with the Pew Charitable Trust last year, I guess, to really look at the role of courts, how to improve court access for civil courts. And so she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience from the court universe as well. So one of the things we're doing on the consent project is we're really looking closely at the legal standards and the requirements, and how to make sure that the solutions are compliant and address all of those requirements, and yet help people sort of provide their consent and move the whole process along. So we may touch base with you again on that one as we see fit.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everyone else is a return visitor here. 419. I think I'm gonna guess that's Karen. Karen.
Yeah, Danielle
Hey, there you
Turnhill.
Okay, Karen.
Hey.
I'm gonna lend you there. So we've really got two sections. We don't have any work group updates that I'm aware of, unless folks do, and then they want to share with us a little bit of that. But the main feature was Jim, and then after Jim is done a bit, I wanted to talk to you about a rapidly or really a very new opportunity that just showed up. As you recall, last week I presented about the meeting we had with the Office of National Coordinator. And as a result of that very positive meeting, we got invited to participate in the upcoming ONC Tech Forum in September 10th and 17th, which is awesome. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and how you all can be involved in that forum. We've been given one of the exhibitor booths, which is great because it gives us a chance to really talk about some of the stuff that the challenging news is we have to get all of our material in by Friday. So it's like building a virtual booth in the next couple of days, but we're working hard on that. And we've got a couple of things we want to share with you and recruit you to help staff the booth. And a number of people on the call here are also other exhibitors. So we're trying to think about ways that we can sort of connect the dots, which is really the prime activity with that. So unless
Daniel, I just have a 1 minute, if I may, before you launch. I want to deeply thank those of you who have contributed to the scan document. I think you all know what that is. If you don't, email me or something. A number of you have, and it's great, and we're very grateful for the time and effort you put into that. I want to remind everybody, we would like sort of the first batch, if you will, of input to be done by this Friday, if possible. So if you can make the time, if you haven't contributed or have more, please, by Friday would be great. And you can keep going after that. We just want a solid block of information with which we can start really writing this thing in earnest. So please, the invitation is there. Please wade in. We need you. We want you. We appreciate you. And we want to keep going with it. That's it. Thank you. And Daniel, back to you.
I thought you were going to say, and we know where you live.
No, that's the enforcer's job, not mine.
Yeah, okay. Well, I know where you live, for that matter. Okay, that's great. Thank you. We have one new participant, Dwayne. Welcome. For new people in the group, we've been inviting people to say hello and kind of where you're from. I don't believe we've seen you on the call before, so you want to just take a minute. Oh, disconnecting the audio now. I'm not sure he's even heard me. Anyone know Dwayne?
Dwayne Brown?
No, not Dwayne Brown. There's another Dwayne.
Oh, no, okay, good. Like, I've been on here. Okay.
Yeah, right. I know, right. There's another Dwayne DeCuto. Dwayne, are you there? Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, welcome. I was just asking, when new people come onto the call, we'd just like you to introduce yourself, kind of where you're from, and just say a few words, what you're involved with.
Oh, I'm Dwayne DeCuto. I work on the ONC LEAP Fire Consent Project, and I'm just dropping in to see how you guys are progressing.
Perfect, great. I suspected that. So welcome to today's call. You're welcome, and we'll be talking more about the ONC forum actually afterwards. I was just mentioning that before. So with that, over to Jim St. Clair from Pneumatic, sorry, pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, you got it.
There you go, great.
Thank you, kind sir. And I would just call out Kay. It's great to see you here. Colin Wallace and I used to talk on a regular basis, and quite a few of my colleagues and some of the consortia we'll talk about today are also involved with Kantara. I send the Kantara Health Identity Assurance Working Group with Barry and a few other folks. So welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. I thought I recognized your name actually, because I've been in on some of those work groups. So
yeah, Colin probably left that sheet behind, all these notes about, who not to talk to, and I was probably close to the top of the list. So yeah.
no, not at all.
Absolutely.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
You bet, absolutely. And bear with me just a minute here while I sort out sharing on my Mac. I had to shift for my, there we go, that should work. If you can't see the screen. So a little bit of background. I have quite a few slides. Some of it's a bit technical. I've been the guy waving his hands around in the air talking about identity as it relates to consent. And we'll walk through some of the mechanics of that. Touch upon both conceptually what identity and consent is, especially in the context outside of the US and EU and GDPR and Canada and what they're working on, which I think, as we've seen with the environmental scan, some of the discussions we've had, as much of what we're doing, certainly in my opinion, relates to changes around policy, procedures, regulatory framework, even culture, as they do as much around technical and architectural considerations for what we call consent or how we enable consent. And I think some time back, I apologize for not making it sooner, there was an intent for me to kind of elaborate a bit and say, well, Jim, what the heck are you talking about with all this identity stuff, and how does it factor in, especially this concept of self-sovereign identity? And happy to walk through all of that for you today. Let's see if I can, there we go. So a couple of these slides are a little bit different, and I try and give credit because it represents an amalgamation of other colleagues of mine and other participants in this community. Self-sovereign identity, as it talks about here, is both an ideology and an architecture. And there are, comparatively small groups, but still represents in absolute terms, thousands of people around the world in various time zones who are working on different aspects of this, either from some sort of group advocacy standpoint, policy standpoint, such as, Tim Boma in Canada, or represent groups like the Hyperledger Foundation, Sovereign, ID Union, et cetera, that are all trying to enable these in consortia with architectures. So from an architecture standpoint, I'll also refer to decentralized identity. That is synonymous with self-sovereign identity, but we'll talk a bit through about what it means from a concept standpoint. So sovereign identity, quite frankly, is based on principles of enlightenment and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are, in fact, folks in this community that you would expect that are zealots about this sort of thing. who believe entirely in the concept of self-sovereignty. No one gets to see my stuff. That always doesn't pertain in healthcare, and we know why for practical purposes, but I did want to emphasize, there are believers in this and who take the idea of universal declarations of human rights seriously, and the concept that I am my own person and that I am my own identity. So the basic premise is that you should control your identity in regards to your relationships and interactions with other people, organizations, and things. And as you'd expect, that that relationship to identity ties into how you manage your own privacy and the consent for sharing your information around those relationships and interactions. The principle of inherent dignity is that we all have inherent dignity independent of birthplace, lineage, or labels, simply because we are human. And that obviously carries over mechanically to principles of social determinants of health, gender identification, sexual orientation, etc., as principles in that dignity that people have an inherent right to protect and not necessarily be forced to share by either process or centralized authority. Now, from our perspective, from the self-sovereign identity perspective, most identity platforms today are administered by centralized authorities, governments, corporations, software providers, etc. In other words, your identity as you interact with people, organizations, ecosystems is generally given to you. You create a password, you build a profile that is stored centrally someplace. You use those credentials to log in. All of us know from just looking at those icons what the underlying implications are for the data that you're giving to them as part of centralized organizations. And in one form or another, they have a vested interest in managing those people. And that vested interest may be with the best of intents, like a healthcare organization, or it could be, truly nefarious, like surveillance capitalism. But either way, you're still putting your trust or putting elements of your personal data and your identity into other organizations that you have to trust or hope somehow aligns to how you feel are being respected in the context of your rights or principles of rights that are important. So why do we have this move away from centralized authorities? We're more and more part of a global civil society. Our social and cultural affiliations and affinities may be aligned across borders and across nationalities or even theologies. We're part of more social networks and not just hierarchies. Borders and the natures of social contracts are changing, even in the midst of globalization and cross-border travel. Issues of tribal identity are important, ethnic identity are important. And then corporations and employers cross borders and as such cross sovereignties as well. As a result, all these parties are renegotiating the nature of their sovereignty and of their identity. So if authorities ignore the voice of ordinary people in these negotiations, that relates to the risks the individuals are greater, and thus self-sovereignty gives an individual a way to renegotiate what it means to be human in the digital world. That's that theology and the ideology principles. Now we'll start getting more into the mechanical aspects of the principles of self-sovereign identity created by a gentleman by the name of Phil Windley about 5-6 years ago. And I highlighted 3 of them because you can see 3 of them called out there: portability, interoperability, and consent go hand in hand with the sort of things we think about in terms of healthcare interoperability, portability of data, and of course, consent, which is, our raison d'etre for our discussions here. Also things like the nature and independence of their existence, control, access, transparency, which transparency comes up also in privacy by design, comes up again in things like GDPR, that the systems and algorithms that are managing your information should be transparent. Also, the principle of minimization is one that recurs across different regulatory frameworks as well, that you shouldn't be asking for more information than you need. And you shouldn't use the excuse that I just need to know more of it to do X as a reason to get around minimization. And then lastly, protection, of which protection is underwritten by the basis that, well, if you're minimizing the data you're collecting in the first place, it helps minimize the things that you have to worry about protecting.
Jim,
Go right ahead, Dan.
Jump in 1 second. Go back 1 slide if you don't mind.
Sure.
I just want to make sure I understand this. I really like the term self-sovereign identity, and I'm assuming, I just want to probe that and pause for a second, because ultimately when we think about consent utility, we're talking about giving people I guess, sovereignty over their own data, what they're going to share. Is that consistent with what that terminology means? And or is there a nuance to it that is different than that?
That is spot on, and I actually feel reassured that you'd picked up on that, because I was kind of concerned about explaining it. But that is exactly right. So if you're thinking about sovereignty over your own identity, that in turn also means, by virtue of being sovereign, I proactively can enable consent for data sharing. And I'll call it Nancy for a second, because I've talked to Nancy before, familiar with UMA. Obviously, we talked a bit about Kentara, this concept of not only proactive consent, which is I choose in advance what I'm sharing, but also granular. We also get into topic areas, and Kentara has work groups on this, around conditional and even temporal aspects of consent. I'll share this with you for this period of time as part of this transaction or what we're doing. And then consistent with GDPR, you won't have that information anymore, or you'll dispose of it and provide me proof of disposing of it. If you get into the new ISO standards like 29184, that talks about consent receipts, which is I give you back a receipt that says, yes, I acknowledge I can have consent for the following things. Or before I extend consent, you acknowledge that you're receiving consent for that, and you'll live up to that. Those are all international standards and developments that are all based in some fashion on these concepts of self-sovereignty.
So I have a related question. Does one sign on to these principles? I mean, do organizations say this is how we, what governs or what guides our thinking? Or how does, maybe you get to this later, but I don't want to lose it. How do people, say, yeah, I believe in those 10 principles?
That's a fantastic question, Adam. And as I get more into the architecture, what the architecture and the open source software consortiums and stuff do is provide the technology to enable it. But you actually didn't ask an easy question. Lumedic is a commercial healthcare IT company. We're the first ones to offer this sort of platform based on this technology within healthcare. I wouldn't go so far as to say that you'd get the CEO to stand up and say, we're advocating for self-sovereign identity. But what we are doing is providing a platform that enables an architecture to do that. Now, the question is, who buys our software, as an example? Obviously, individuals can't just buy software that plugs into Epic. So it has to be an organizational decision. So this is connected to Providence Health System's Epic system. Architecturally, it isn't fully deployed to recognize all of these capabilities. And as you'd see from an ideology standpoint, many of these ideas are vision or things to aspire to, but there are technical aspects of implementation and procedural considerations along the way. Does that help?
So I want to ask one clarifying question. I believe self-sovereignty goes a little bit further than when we typically talk consent, because usually consent is only needed for information that is considered outside of the user's role or organization. However, isn't self-sovereignty more about I own my data? So even if I'm working with, let's say, my primary care provider, that I own that history, he doesn't. And so whether or not he's got access to all of that data is up to me to determine.
Mary, that's a fantastic question, and you're exactly right. And part of why I wanted to present this was to stimulate understanding that there is a whole community out there, a global community, and that things like GDPR and others embody the framework and principles that are here that are very different, and that you articulated very well, that are a different mindset with how we do things. And you mentioned about patient owning their data. As you probably are familiar, 49 out of 50 states right now, with the exception of Live Free or Die in New Hampshire, say the owner of the EHR owns that patient's data. So what you get out of the Cures Act, the closest thing from a self-sovereign standpoint is the ability to exert control over that data, edit rights, share and stuff. But we're still not going so far as to say own that data. The ultimate vision for self-sovereign identity in groups like My Data Global and others is to say we have third-party personal data storage and encrypted data vaults, and things don't live in an EHR or live in a record. I get to control them and then share them out through consent-based mechanisms. That, obviously that presents tremendous, business and procedural, even ethical challenges if you're talking about a healthcare provider that needs what they need to know as part of rendering an encounter or a prescription, something like that. But I think we're starting to encounter that as a challenge anyways, because under the Cures Act, I can walk in and say, hey, that HIV test result, I don't want that there, take it out. Well, there's tremendous ramifications with what that means in terms of your continuity of care, how your provider feels about that. But the law says you can do it. And that in many ways is similar to the sorts of principles here that comes with responsibilities on the individual's part. And what that means for societal implications, socioeconomic responsibilities, which we have to work through. But I don't want the group to not be aware that this is a thing. And there are groups who feel this way on a worldwide basis.
Yeah, I was just listening to, I was at Chic earlier this week, and one of the HIEs was talking about this as a problem. How do you not track someone, because you have to at the very least know that they don't want to be tracked, which requires that you track them.
Right, exactly.
Catch-22.
Decentralization in org.
I just threw this block in here real quick but I mean, the conversation has been wonderful and I greatly appreciate the comments. I think we're starting to appreciate, if you break down the key elements of GDPR, its relationship back to self-sovereign identity, even though GDPR kind of predates some of this SSI concepts, but they're all related and connected in terms of, data protection principles of what your identity is, how you use that to manage your privacy, and then the consent for sharing under those data protection principles. I also want to touch upon the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework because they're our neighbors to the north, and I know quite a few people involved there. Canada is not technically under GDPR, but they adopted a lot of the principles, even having Information Commission Office, which are like chief privacy officers for the province and for the country. And it is in the process of rolling out this Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which is a framework that will implement these concepts of identity technologies in SSI within the public sector. So specifically, Ontario and others will start implementing digital identities using the principles of self-sovereignty as part of that. Well, I'll let her read it in. So. Now, as we get more into the technical discussion, here you'll see that I stopped using self-sovereign and refer to decentralized. Now we're getting into architectural consideration and what it means to go from those principles to the way software is going nowadays, and especially some of the standards organizations that I'm involved with. The traditional world, many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with centralized aspects of secure sockets layer, TLS, engaging with your web browser, being able to get to trusted websites, etc. We are now largely in the federated world, and lots of organizations representing federated identities, Karen Alliance, OpenID, etc. Federated takes the step away from the strictly server-based sort of centralized identity, but still relies on concepts of like identity service providers. In other words, I establish an identity with something or an organization, and that organization helps manage my credentials to be able to say, I am who I say I am. And that's different than ultimately still being able to say, I'm only going to present those aspects of my identity that I choose to, and that there are other cryptographic means, which we'll talk a bit about on the decentralized side, to cryptographically attest in a system, I'm Jim, I'm not going to tell you any more than I'm Jim, and here's my cryptographic trust as a holder of a verifiable credential that I am who I say I am. But you're not going to ask me 10 more questions or knowledge-based questions as to where I am and where I live, because I just choose not to disclose that information. So first of all, just to set the definition of what a credential is, because everything talking forward for this is around this idea of verifiable credential. It's a proof about something about ourselves. And all of us are used to these things. I didn't get a chance to go in here and paste a CDC card in the middle. I should have, for, you know, physical credentials, something a government gives us, something an organization gives us that gives us attributes to what our identity is. The problem with today's credentials, and I know all of you are familiar with this, they don't always scale easily. They can't easily be verified online. They're easy to fake or forge. All of these have come up with the various discussions around vaccination credentials that I'm sure you've seen, and the concept of carrying around a paper card as a means to validate something. So verifiable credentials instead are a digital attestation of one identity owner about another. They're often called digital attestations or claims, though for the sake of standardization, we've settled on verifiable credentials. Much like your wallet with the different things that you own, verifiable credentials are something you keep in your digital wallet. DIDS refers to a decentralized identifier. I'll touch upon that. That's another standard that goes hand in hand with verifiable credentials. And you can manage then different aspects of your identity as you present them to engage in different things cryptographically and electronically based on what those verifiable credentials have. So you can see the example there that maybe one of which is my auto loan verification. So I am engaging with my bank around loan verification details. I present what I choose to present, except a digital credential that says I am who I say I am, only for an identity as necessary with data minimization just for that auto loan. That could be different than the characteristics I present in my master's degree in finance for educational purposes, for class attendance, etc. But it allows me to manage through those digital credentials what my identity is in every time, essentially eliminating that problem that I have to show my driver's license with all of my personal information just to get into the bar so I can buy a scotch. Verifiable credentials are all digital. They're under the owner's control. They're held in a digital wallet on your phone. For those of you, of course, with iPhones, it's very similar to the Apple Wallet concept. Very scalable, electronically speaking. They are also based, and we'll talk about this a bit more, on the JSON object format. Same thing as FHIR messages. Much harder to fake. They have cryptographic information, a whole bunch of stuff, which I won't go into on the cryptographic side. Something we call zero knowledge proofs, which is a cryptographic ability to prove I am who I say I am without having to go through a bunch of additional characteristics and queries and share more information. And the data by itself could be useless to thieves, because the concept is if I'm only sharing different aspects of what's cryptographically verifiable, someone just stealing it won't necessarily be able to do that. On the other hand, if I present my VCI QR code and someone takes a picture of it, I've lost control of that data once it goes out of my hands.
I want to understand that just a hair better.
Sure.
So if you lose your phone with all this data in it, a smart hacker or someone who understands verifiable credentials can't manipulate it to do anything of value?
That's a great question, Adam, and I would describe it this way. So speaking from a Lumetic solution standpoint, if you lose your phone, first of all, there's the aspect of whether somebody can unlock it. So, you know, the number of phones
if it's locked,
you know, and most of them default to lock, especially. So, and I'll use the iPhone as an example. You know, you can't pass Face ID. It's really difficult to hack the code. So let's assume that that takes place, and that's different than if you log into Find My iPhone, or you go to your phone company and they remotely wipe it for you, which is possible. Beyond that, if I lost my phone and get a new phone, you can use your Lumetic credentials to download your wallet, and in doing so, it'll give you a new set of download your wallet, and in downloading your wallet, pulls down all the credentials that you have there. So, you know, if they get into the phone and they can't biometrically authenticate to the device, that means they can't authenticate to the credentials that are stored in it anyways, making them worthless. Now, you know, as a former IT auditor, there's probably a whole school of thought out there, which quite frankly, we haven't gotten into, about hacking the phone and then hacking the credential. But it's still based on AES 256 and other forms of encryption that are still quite secure in different ways. And then also other things you may need to do when you present, or who you're presenting that verifiable credential to, may cause a challenge for being able to use it and to steal it and use it in a nefarious way, if that helps. So there's 3 roles in the verifiable credential, what we call the verifiable credential trust triangle. And I have a couple graphics to show this. The issuer, the one that actually creates and issues the credentials, the holder, i.e. me, that is holding those credentials in the wallet, and then the verifier that has some technical means to verify the credential that I'm holding through a proof, like a QR code, a barcode, some other means for exchanging that from the holder to prove that I am the right holder and I am who I say I am.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Matt.
Sure. So if you have a situation where in order to get this issued, like in order to I've got to answer a few questions about myself, or I've to get that as a first step, right? Could there be essentially multiple issuers? So I go to one issuer to prove who I say I am, but then there's another issuer that's a health information exchange or something, or is it they're only going to be one issuer and one person in each of these places? Is that
I'm just trying to fast forward through a couple of slides for time and also to get to your question. So
yeah.
For instance, here's the example of the IATA travel pass, and I hope this helps answer it. IATA, the International Air Travel Agency, is working with some of the same companies that we are. It's built on the same technology. The idea being that you are the holder. You have gone to a testing lab. Testing lab says you're COVID-19 free. You get a credential back from that lab. You then provide that to IATA. IATA issues you a travel pass that says, good to go, you meet the criteria. You get to the airline, you present that verifiable credential from IATA, and they electronically verify and say, yes, it meets the rules, and you're all set to go. And that could consist, depending on what's required, of one or more credentials. You may have a vaccination credential, you could have a test credential, maybe there's a third credential associated with your identity, as in you're not traveling from a certain place. Your wallet can have more than one credential in it. And then depending on the scenario, that could be combined together to another credential, or those credentials could each be verified separately.
Got it.
Yeah. And just to kind of give you a look at what we're talking about from here, the holder, of course, is the individual with their wallet. We just walked through the issuer. The verifier is the airline. There is, for those familiar with PKI, there's a public key in the form of a decentralized identifier that is put onto a ledger, so that when the verifier is checking it, they can say, oh, this is a valid issuer because this credential has both the traveler's valid information on it, as well as a valid issuer saying that it's recent. So that obviously helps ensure that the network of issuers is kept up to date, so that you don't find yourself with a fraudulent issuer or an issuer that doesn't meet the rules for testing or something along those lines. But what we emphasize, and I skipped over this slide a bit, from a privacy standpoint, there's lots to talk about. Can't use blockchain for privacy. The blockchain and the ledger in this particular case is only for the public key. So it's only for something that's being shared publicly. All of the individual's information is stored within the credential based on how that credential is put together and controlled by the holder with what they share. And there we go. Quick plug. So this is the way we set it up in our wallet, just to give you a snapshot. There could be a COVID viral test, there could be some other self-assessment. Our vision is, and as we're trying to build upon this and integrate with other mechanisms, to have other credentials that may be associated with a provider-specific visit or other immunization information records, etc. And then, as you can see there, the idea that you can connect with an institution and share that information, or initiate sharing your credential. A use case that we're just kind of starting to dive back into, which we set aside for a moment after COVID, was patient registration. And Providence Health had an estimate of something like $12 million a year that could be attributed to the amount of effort to constantly verify and re-verify identity, and checking people in, and what is their eligibility status and their registration. And we offered this right off the bat, not only from the standpoint of how the patient can control that information, but let's just get all the parties to agree upon a digital standard or sharing a verifiable credential, that if they have that verifiable credential, they present it then it validates it without a bunch of the additional effort that they've gone into and saves the organization money. So there's both the self-sovereign privacy consent aspect to it, but there's also an ability to get organizations to trust one another how to share a credential as a means of improving and streamlining verification processes. I mentioned a bit about privacy by design. I can send you a link for the research paper that's done by the former Canadian Privacy Commissioner, Anne Cavoukian, who came up with privacy by design. You'll notice I mentioned some of these things before, the idea that it's proactive and preventative, it's not remedial. Privacy is the default setting, i.e. my privacy is always enforced first. Privacy is embedded into the design, meaning that when you're thinking through the system organization, how does privacy get represented? You should have full functionality of privacy across the entire spectrum. End-to-end security is obviously important. Once again, visibility and transparency. Everybody understands how the system operates, and then respect for the user privacy. In other words, making it user-centric. And I had a PowerPoint. I guess that's the end of my PowerPoint slide. Okay. Yeah, and good. I left some time behind. I was moving a little bit quick there. Any questions? Happy to elaborate. Anything that anyone didn't understand, or anything that wanted to discuss further, or move them into other areas. For Dan and for Adam, I wouldn't go into the depth here, but I'm hoping to have conveyed some of these ideas around identity that I think we wanted to include as principles within the consent scan as well too. So.
Yeah, very cool, Jim. Yeah, I'd love to have a short offline conversation with how that fits in and where it fits in, and get your fingers on a keyboard to help fit it in.
Absolutely. And I saw Rita joined us. Rita and I are both part of the ONC FAST identity work group. And as we were working through the HL7 implementation guide draft, we had some questions come up just internally that related to this, on issues of, well, what about the individual's consent, and how do we do patient matching based on consent for certain PII elements? And so they're out there, and they're operational issues that we're sorting through, even for for HL7.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was going to ask was, how does this play into the question of person matching across domains? I can imagine how it is, but I'd rather hear it from you.
That's a wonderful question, and we're not quite sure, Brian. So not to get off of this topic, but I will say for the sake of the audience, we've been kind of sorting through probabilistic patient matching and what are some of the characteristics. And one of our colleagues, God bless her, had gone through, well, we'll just ask them these questions. And if that doesn't return enough, we'll ask them these questions. And if they need more information, we'll ask them these questions. I'm like, well, that's kind of the old way of doing business. But, how do we securely identify a patient and establish patient matching in different ways where they don't wish to disclose their address because they're homeless? They don't want to dive into gender identification. They're gender fluid. They're a adolescent. And so there are aspects of what they're allowed to share and not allowed to, or excuse me, what they're able to share, or what they can choose not to share. And how do those factor into it? So just coming up with some agreement upon what are good enough for matching, what are some of the guideposts we can use for establishing an identity that we can share identity amongst organizations without compromising the principles of privacy and consent in doing so.
Jim, it's Rita. Thanks for bringing up FAST earlier. I want to touch on something that also relates to Brian's question, because one interesting question that was asked in our call earlier, if you recall, that's relevant to the cross-domain question that Brian just raised, is what are we calling an organization? Like somebody raised a question around when we talk about cross-organizational matching, what does that mean? What are we actually identifying as an organization? And I think that's relevant to the domain question as well, because what does that mean? I mean, is that, I think when I heard the question, I thought that an organization could be many things. It could also just be a vendor or a system. And so I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I don't. And I think Paul made a very good argument about that in our work group. And I think it needs further definition. And I realize it makes it a little bit harder, but to go back to Brian's point, and I think Paul brought this up as well, is it organizational consent? Is it a patient's consenting to do a search against an HIE or against a record, if the provider's doing the search, does the provider first need consent back from the individual? What, you know, which organization are we talking about when we say organization? And of course, the subsequent legal or regulatory framework that applies to that organization relative to what they're doing. I think that's a great point, Rita. I'm not sure we're quite close to solving it, even just defining it some more.
So Jim, I had a few thoughts. I mean, I've been thinking about how would this be operationalized in, you know, across healthcare and human service domain circumstance. Like what is implementing this, not from a technical perspective, but from an onboarding patient by patient perspective, say for treating homeless people, right? And I feel like this is one of those areas where having those healthcare and human service partnerships can be critical, because a lot of these human service organizations and homeless shelters are used to walking the patient through things like getting like some kind of form of state like recognized identification, because, you know, guess what, those are, if you're helping someone with their SNAP benefits, you need these proof. You need proof of this, you need proof of that. If you're helping someone get SSI, you need proof of this, proof of that, etc. So this is where, like, you know, onboarding someone into a system where they are digitally represented with this decentralized identifier would take place as part of a process of helping that person get actual physical identifiers, right, that can be associated, whether it's a utility bill or a driver's license or whatever it might be, that can be associated with that digital identifier, right? And then gradually, as those things have been identified, then the technology could be used across a continuum of care from health care and human service organizations to better coordinate care for that patient. Does that sound like it's in line with how you would see something like that coming?
It absolutely is, and I would point out, and it made me think of something else too, which I'll bring up. And there's nothing that says that well, I mean, the ideology might be against the driver's license, for instance, but the architecture and the implementation and the identity verification, the means to have an identity proof, is not necessarily opposed to that sort of thing, but really about enabling the control of that information. So
Exactly.
what I haven't mentioned here is that the software I was showing you, even though we're a commercial company, everything is open source and developed by global consortiums, mainly within the Linux Foundation. And one of the working groups that I've worked with has actually been a human trafficking working group that was looking at self-sovereign identity for human trafficking victims as part of reestablishing life. And it shocked me when they were first making a presentation where they said something like there's a recidivism rate of 68% for human trafficking repatriated victims, because you repatriate them, you establish a traditional identity for them, you give them an address, you give them a home license, and the folks go and find them, kidnap them, and make them human traffic victims again. So they were looking at, well, if we give the individual self-sovereignty and the ability to have different identifiers, that, you know, maybe it's a driver's license number or something like that, but they have control over how that information is shared. Would that potentially help protect their ability to not be a victim to a centralized ID system that someone else takes advantage of to go and hunt them back down again? I know we've touched a bit about consent and aspects of like domestic violence. Years before I was involved with this, when I was implementing a health benefits exchange in Vermont Social Services asked us, okay, well, this is a great system. Somebody sets up a login who is trying to get healthcare benefits. They're in a domestic violence shelter. They have reestablished their address. They don't want their abusive spouse to know where they are. What stops them from somebody who knows their wife's social security number and email address to log in and say, oh, now they're living there?
Yeah.
Well, you know, again, these principles of representing a credential for yourself instead of perhaps name, social address are ways to abstract out and give greater control and consent. It's not saying that you wouldn't have traditional government services or identification cards, but how the individual is able to participate in managing that, how those elements of PII are controlled, if that helps. So like, here's another one too. So a colleague of mine runs a similar company that is establishing birth attestation documentation for populations that don't have any. His first pilot project was with Myanmar with the Gates Foundations, uses a biometric device to establish biometric route of authentication, because iris scanning is like, 6 nines reliable or something like that. Says that, Bob is Bob. That's biometric information to support that. That biometric information is put into a decentralized system and associated with a verifiable credential. Well, Bob can then control that verifiable credential, but they have a record that the government is now acknowledging that says, I am who I say I am, and this is my birth date. Right. And just that foundation of digital identity, the World Bank has done a great analysis about what that means, just to be able to participate in societal activities you couldn't before.
So,
Dan, I'm sorry, I haven't left you a lot of time.
I just need like 10, 15 minutes. We'll go for a couple more questions. This, I think, is really crucial as we think about, the scan and what we want to present out there in terms of, what we're seeing. And, you've sat in on some of the interviews and others have as well. And it's, pretty piecemeal in terms of either you're creating identity for people within your system already that are engaged, it seems like. And we've had some conversations with some of the, community providers connecting that way, which is, fine, but excludes a lot of other folks, as Matt was saying, homeless people or other people who are educational folks who raised a question about education and justice. And it was like, it's on the roadmap. It's not something we're addressing now. And so the question is, how do we translate this very complex technical way of identity management next generation, right? So that we're representing that if we end up being able to actually pilot something like this or actually advance this work, and because identity management is so important and credentials are so important to everybody, how do we represent that in a way that's not sort of way too technical and or something that we have to sort of present as we're talking about it. Like that's where the proverbial puck where it's going, right?
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I almost kind of regretted I had quite a few technical slides in there, but I wanted to be thorough with an audience that I know is quite capable of getting it. But I think at a high level, we'll summarize without being either too ideological or too technocratic, just some of these principles of decentralization that other colleagues of mine have written about that kind of capture that at a higher level, just to kind of associate the message that privacy and consent, as we're looking at it for a lot of these consent management approaches, is fine, but it still doesn't reflect that you have to tie the management of the identity with that consent, and that privacy and consent start first and foremost with control over your identity information. Right. Because consent mechanisms are fine, but if you're continuously disclosing identity over again in various databases, your ability to infer information or get it from a different source or big data problems are a challenge. So it starts with, and I think I've suggested before, if I have control over aspects of my identity, I may be more flexible in my consent. If you really need to know these lab results, I might be more willing to share them with you if I can anonymize some of the aspects of identifying myself in advance, until we come back and have a separate discussion about a transaction that says, look, Jim, I really need to know where you live because these could be environmental factors with this lab. Are you willing to share that? And then we enter into a new conditional consent arrangement.
Yeah,
No, go on, Marisol.
I think we also need to just be mindful and think about this in the hands of everybody. And is it really ethical? If you think about it from a really practical practice perspective, or are we further widening the gap in equity?
I think that's a great question, Mary Sarah. And what we have looked at, we have an equity work group of our own in Lemedic is, are there aspects of managing this identity that improve equity? Because by managing identity, it allows us to avoid potential pitfalls in racial discrimination or gender profiling or some other things. I think to your question, though, if you get all the way to the other end of the spectrum, kind of like where I started from, if you're completely self-sovereign, does it risk shutting someone out of something or
Well,
not getting services that they need?
No, actually, the position I was thinking from was in order to be self-sovereign, in order for me to control my data, I actually have to have time to control my data. If I don't have time or accessibility to control my data, then I relinquish that, in scare quotes, right.
But Mary Sarah, like the state of law today is that, the electronic health record companies own your medical data. Like that is the law as it is today, right? And so a technology solution could allow people to, from a technological perspective, control their data if that software was set up in that way, right? But
Well,
legally speaking, people don't own their data. So I think, is your point then that one would need to do the extra work to make sure that that homeless person is able to be onboarded on a solution like this so that they can control their data? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they don't have access to that and to a solution, first of all. Second of all, just going back to Maslow's, hierarchy, controlling their data is not going to be very high, most likely on their list of priorities for that day. They're probably more concerned about where they're going to sleep that night or where their next meal is coming from. So what I'm thinking, what occurs to me is I can appreciate the implications for race and gender, but when it comes to individuals who are working 3 jobs or individuals who aren't technologically savvy or individuals that don't have broadband or access to technology, that those are the individuals that are going to kind of be left out of the conversation, or else they're going to or it's going to fall to such a low priority given all the other priorities that it doesn't matter that it's a right.
Mary Sarah, are they in the conversation today?
Some of them are, because they consent at the point typically of interaction with an individual. So if you've got somebody going in for services, yes, it's very time consuming and all, but at that point in time, they're executing their will. Hopefully they have an informed consent process where they're walking them through exactly what does this mean. So they wouldn't have, it would be more in their hands, is my understanding, as opposed to like the caseworker's hands.
One example that's come up recently, and forgive me for not pronouncing this properly, the Rohingya, if I pronounced that properly, out of Myanmar, who were refugees from Myanmar, they were basically at best enticed, at worst forced, to provide their biometric samples to the Gates Foundation in return for access to services and food. And of course, at the time, they were far more concerned about making sure that they got a roof over their heads and some food than to worry about whether or not they had proper informed consent on doing this. So, there is a challenge here in dealing with any new technology of making sure that it's properly used. That information that was collected, independent of who did it, ended up getting back into the hands of the military in Myanmar, and it's been used to chase down some of those refugees.
Yeah.
which by the way
I
is a
bring
different
that up
system.
not to diss Jim here in
No,
this.
no, I was gonna say that was a different system than the one my friend.
Yeah,
Look, I mean,
it doesn't mean it can't be done.
I just
I
wanna-
just think it needs to be something we take into account.
Yeah, I just want to agree with you, Mary Sarah. And I think so first of all, there's pluses and minuses to each. There's, you don't want to create a situation, or I marvel at some of my colleagues in self-sovereign identity who are creating situations, in my opinion, of consent fatigue. Fine. You want to make sure that you control every aspect of your information. Here's 16 queries that your phone is going to send back and forth, and you have to consent to every one. You don't want to create that challenge. I think on a related note to what you were pointing out, we're looking at it from, we as in some of the communities are looking at guardianship. So what about an individual that is incapable? How can that individual have their rights or consent managed through this identity platform on behalf of a guardian, a caregiver? What are the ethical considerations? What are legal considerations? How does the architecture for that look? And none of that is an immediate answer. I'm only wedded to in the fact that I think these are questions that have to be asked. Yeah. And most importantly, as a technologist, here's an open source software architecture that's relatively simple for implementation, but spawns an hour worth of discussion with fine folks like this to realize there are ramifications organizationally and societally that we need to put to bed.
So let me put a pause on the conversation. That's a perfect segue. That's what we really need to articulate and succinctly as we set out the principles of this scan. The more we talk about the challenges and the opportunities of it, the more we're seeing, hey, we really need to make sure we're articulating the questions on here. And Chris is not on, she had to jump off here, but Chris it really articulated that yesterday in terms of one of the interviews we were conducting. It's like, what don't we know, right? Or what, I think we've described some of that here. So I think up front, we don't need to be definitive. We need to, sort of shape the future and the vision, the principles. And I think this is going to go a long way to shaping that in terms of identity, because that's such a big deal, especially in our world today. So thank you for that, Jim. I'm sure we'll have plenty more conversation. I'm really interested in also how we can partner with FAST and the work that's going on at Feds to, again, make sure we're not recreating the wheel. And that's a really good sort of segue into just a few more minutes I wanted to share with you. I know we're going to go to 5:15 or so, what's coming up. So thanks for being able to stick around. Again, thanks for the presentation. It's terrific.
Thank you. I'm glad everybody liked it. So
many topics, and you can tell by the conversation, we're just kind of scratching the surface here. So as I mentioned, we had our call with the ONC last week. We thought it went pretty well. We got into pretty deep conversation about what we're trying to do here on consent, and I think it certainly generated interest. And I think one of the questions that we called was, so what next? And how could we, sort of partner and collaborate with ONC? And the word we basically heard back was, this looks good. We want to support this work. That's my word. You saw today by Dwayne's participation, we've been getting lots of emails from folks from ONC about participating. And then we got an invitation last Wednesday, I think last Wednesday, to become one of the exhibitors in the ONC Tech Forum. So I thought that was a sort of a terrific follow-up for us to be able to at least, show the flag, as we say. And so we have been, and along with that is an exhibit, sort of a digital virtual exhibit booth. I'll show you what that looks like. And in that, we're still exploring it. I know several groups on here today. I know Lumetic will be participating in that. And I know Direct is part of that. I'm not sure anyone's representing that here today. But there may be others. Matt, I know you're participating peripherally in some of the work with Direct there, folks. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to actually sort of show some of those connections and engage in some of the conversations. So let me just say a few more things and get your thoughts as well on how we best can take advantage of the time. So you may be familiar with the platform that they have. They are providing to folks, and let me just share this with you. It's pretty cool. I think I actually haven't been to I haven't actually attended one of these forums using this yet. I don't know how many people have, but the digital sort of booth is what we are provided, and we can configure it. It's a configurable booth, so we have our branding and our welcome message, and that's what I was struggling with earlier today, to get a short message up there to welcome people. And then these are all configurable along the side here. So we have opportunities to put in documents, to put in URLs, to put in our demos, to invite people into conversations, we think. And so we're busy now, and Amanda's and Brian and myself and Adam and others are sort of configuring that now, so that there'll be a certain amount of information available to folks about Unify, about consent, some of the work we've done in the past, so as to be able to share that with people who come in and will be participating over the 2 days. I'm sure not everybody will come to the booth. I think there's 14 exhibitors, but for the participants who will be there, there's a lot of participants there. I know I was at the last, I think it was the last in-person conference I was at, was the ONC meeting a couple of years ago. So it really does represent an opportunity both to showcase our wares. It'll be up for several months afterwards, they said. And we're hoping that with the way they've described the platform, it's flexible enough that we can actually hold online conversations and some breakouts. Folks who are, Jim, I don't know if you're deeply involved with the setup on this or anybody else, but if you are, that would be useful to know.
I am singularly involved. I sent them an email, and I was just catching up on my emails from Vegas and realized, to your point, oh, I got to get this booth ready by the end of the week.
Yeah, by Friday. Okay, so we're all working on that. We're not alone. That's good.
So Dan, this is Nancy Lush. I'll just add, so the Conterra Initiative did a booth at the last ONC session.
Okay.
You could take a look at that and see what we put together, if that's helpful.
That would be
And
great.
I know we did a recording that was published, and if you'd like to use that recording, I can send you the link to that as well,
Perfect. Yeah.
if that's helpful.
So we can put up stuff, and I think they told me that they're going to keep it up for 3 or 4 months afterwards, so we can point people to it as a resource. We have a lot of materials on our site, but we're not going to, obviously we're going to try to be as discreet as we can to provide stuff that really focuses on these related initiatives. So folks, from Conterra, Jim, your work from Lumetic, other folks here, Dwayne, I don't know if we have something about, SEDS that we can sort of, at least sort of a position paper or a short white paper or even a 2-pager. Other things we can sort of make sure we can reference in the resources section, because I think we can add as many documents as we want. So that's what's happening. We're working towards that. A couple of requests I have to you folks. One of the things I'd love to be able to do, and Nancy, maybe you know this because you participated, or Jim, maybe you heard this, is these breakout sessions. In the instructions that they provided us, it looks like they have a sort of a similar to a Zoom format, or you can actually use Zoom or whatever else you want embedded in there. So did you guys take advantage of that last time, or are you aware of that?
Yeah, and the last one, I know the Conterra Initiative had somebody staffing the booths during they had certain time frames, or maybe it was only like an hour or 2 a day. We actually had people staffing it all day. It was not very well attended generally, but some of them were. I think actually the Karen group was more well attended. So it just kind of depends on what you have there. But we had people on staff who could basically answer the questions for anybody that showed up.
Yeah. So yeah, we don't know if this is a long run for short slide or for us, and for this initiative in particular, I think it may, it may generate enough interest from people who have interest, especially when they start to see the social services, human services represented, and the social determinants of health. One of the things ONC said is that they will try to get the SDOH presenters to prompt, folks to pay attention to this in their sessions and between sessions. We'll also be doing some bunch of outreach to our list. We have about 5,000 people on our list and going to be inviting them into the conversation as well. But it's a bit of an opportunity to, even if we get it in front of 10 people who are seriously interested and are bringing different perspectives to the table, including our philanthropy partners. I think that will be very useful to explain and share what we're doing. So to your last point, Nancy, they do request that we staff the virtual booth all the time, and so we're looking for volunteers, for people who can, spend an hour or a couple hours or a bunch of time there, and they're asking us to sort of identify those folks so we can bring them in. If you have interest in that, just send in the chat. You can include your I'm in the chat, and Amanda will collect names and emails and all your biometric information so we can track you down. As a joke. So yeah, we would love to have your, again, participation. Again, it could just be a limited amount of time, but I think the more voices we get there, that will be that'll be helpful for us. Certainly, we'll be staffing it as best we can, and we'll be asking other people. So, so go ahead and if you think you're interested, or if you want to have a conversation about it, just please let Amanda know here in the chat or afterwards. But in the chat would be great because we got to do this by Friday. So act now and you get entered into the contest to win a OPL slicer and dicer along the way there. The other thing is this, one of the conversations I want to have, if we can structure this conversation and promote it, is around both Unify and also around, at least around the consent utility. And I would like to see if we can bring Lumedic and others direct into that conversation. Exactly how we're doing that, we've got a couple of questions out to Jennifer and Allison, who are coordinating on the ONC side, to see how we do that. We haven't gotten an exact answer yet, how we would promote that or put that on an agenda, of sorts. But if you're open to that, interested in it, then we'll try to schedule something to make that conversation happen, and ideally bring other people to the table. So those are two things I wanted to share with you. And of course, if there's any documentation around the stuff that we could put into our resource center, again, the Conterra stuff, or Matt, some of the stuff on OCL and that kind of thing. Dwayne, if there's stuff on SEDS that would describe it, because I think we're my feeling is on ONC and the work that they're doing, fantastic stuff, but we have the opportunity to sort of bring the social sector to the table in many ways. And as you've heard me sort of describe in the past, I think that's an opportunity for us to really sort of wave that flag and represent the interconnectedness of education and health and public health and human services and all those kinds of things. So that's what I'm wanted to share with you about that. If there are any thoughts, questions, responses, clarifications, now would be a great time to say that, or raise the conversation, raise the question.
This is Dwayne with CDS. So just a question from what you need.
Yeah.
I guess that'd be the question. What exactly do you need?
So actually, thank you for reminding me. One of the conversations we wanted to have, one of the primary conversations was, and I had actually thought about asking you to participate, Dwayne, if we can hold these breakout groups and we can sort of promote them, and we'll know that more about tomorrow. We wanted to host a conversation between at least 3 of the standards groups. So between HL7, who's presenting with folks from MITRE, or other folks who can represent HL7 fire as standard, NEAM as a standard for justice, and some of the other areas that NEAM is involved with directly, and then SEDS, and the Common Educational Data Standards. So it seemed to me that bringing that conversation together with a few prompting questions about how do we integrate those things would be super important and super interesting.
Yeah, I'd agree. I totally agree with that. That's
so I take that as you'd be willing to participate in that conversation. Great.
Oh yeah, that's the main reason why I'm here. So yep.
Yeah. So that's great. And so Paul Warmley, who's our board member of stewards and also a NEAM aficionado, along with Brian, are certainly capable of sort of handling the NEAM part of the conversation. The fire part of the conversation and the standards is we haven't actually approached anybody directly on that. So I don't know if there's anyone on this call, although it might be great to get somebody from HL7 or from the group that, you know, the MITRE group that's representing that, or somebody from ONC even, who would be representing that. Any ideas about a name of a person who would engage in that kind of conversation would be very useful.
Which specific kind of conversation having to do with fire?
So the intersection, how does fire, NEAM, and SEDS live together? Recognizing that if information is going to be shared between these domains, education, justice, and health.
I can address that. And matter of fact, I was just in a conversation with Linnell James about a similar topic.
Okay. Are there other folks that we ought to be inviting into that conversation from the HL7 world or from the FAST world or from the ONC world that are fire aficionados?
Daniel, I'm wondering, usually when we talk about data sharing, we're talking about data being shared out from health or going into health. And so HL7 and fire are big. What about when health is just one of multiple and it's actually one of the social programs that is kind of holding the data, and then fire does not come into play in the same way? I think that's something worth talking about, or, you know, including at least as a bullet in there, because I know there's more and more organizations that are interested in trying to figure that out.
Well, that is in fact how we ended up kind of launching way back when.
Yeah.
You know, a couple of years ago, we were approaching the problem from the perspective of how do we map between these entire different domains? How do we map healthcare information to education? How do we map education information to healthcare or child welfare? And that approach of trying to boil the ocean very quickly became obviously the wrong approach. The other problem that we ran into was that while we had great data definitions in healthcare and great protocol definitions for standards in healthcare, whether it's fire or HL7v2 or direct trust or, you know, et cetera. We were lucky if we had data definitions defined, for instance, for justice through NEAM, but no standards for how to exchange any justice-based elements. Matter of fact, the NEAM Technical Architecture Committee is only now, and I'm on that committee, is only now this coming year considering how we're going to define a message passing specification. So in the absence of having any standards for child welfare, childcare, housing, we barely have a specification for HMIS. I shouldn't say barely, Eric's done a great job on it. We have some specifications for education in the form of the Access for Learning SIF specification, but it's not universally implemented by all of the student information record systems. How do we figure out how we're going to exchange information in support of, for instance, the Integrated Care for Kids program? So what we ended up doing and what we've been demonstrating over the last year or so is, let's talk about it not in terms of how we map entire domains or how we, you know, make use of entire big protocol standards that don't exist. Let's instead identify what specific pieces of information need to be moved from one system to another system in order to satisfy the needs of a particular user story or use case. And then figure out what is the best mechanism for exchanging that information. And what we've ended up doing is actually making good use of the fire subscription resource or fire referral mechanisms for exchanging information not only between healthcare and non-clinical systems, but also between two different non-clinical systems entirely. And the final little tidbit in all of this, just to kind of nail this concept home, is that there's absolutely nothing special about FHIR as a protocol. The way FHIR works is that there are these things called resources, which are really just object class specifications, schemas, in an XML schema sense, for things that you want to be able to represent as instances in your environment. And you get at them through HTTP operations, get, put, post, and delete. The same operations that we use all across the industry now as part of the Open API effort. And that's exactly the same mechanism that Access for Learning uses for their SIF, Student Information System protocol. It's the exact mechanism that, in fact, we are talking about in the name TAC for how to exchange or access name justice, for instance, objects. So there's not a whole lot of magic going on here in terms of interoperability between these systems. We just have systems that have different object class specifications, some with some alignment with each other, which is great because it makes it easier, for instance, to do person matching between systems if they all have similar concepts of what human demographics are, like what your street address is, or what your social security number is. And then we all make use of the same mechanisms for moving stuff back and forth that all of the other systems use for moving stuff back and forth. And that's how we cut the Gordian knot in terms of dealing with the different kinds of, if you will, differences in what people now call APIs, but are really just object class specifications accessed through HTTPS, usually. And I'm done there. My apologies for going on such a long rant. I shocked everybody to silence.
No,
Just quick. I agree. There you go.
yeah, my point, Brian, was just that FHIR serves a purpose, but isn't entirely necessary in every instance. So, yeah, that's all.
Yeah, and we're not using FHIR as an overall healthcare protocol in this case, but they do have some interesting object class specifications they've already written. They've already well tested out in the form of a publish and subscribe mechanism, which, by the way, was based on an open source project that MITRE did a while back. They've got a referral mechanism, which is great. We now have, in the Gravity project, we now have not just many of us from Unify on the Gravity project defining closed loop referrals for social determinants of health, but we also have Aunt Bertha, we have Unite Us and NowPow participating in those efforts. You know, yeah, we're not trying to make everything, we're not trying to implement all of FHIR, every single FHIR resource or object class specification for you know, education, but certainly making use of this publish and subscribe mechanism that FHIR calls the FHIR subscription resource as a means of saying, I'm interested in your piece of information over there. Would you let me know if it changes? That's a great way of reusing or repurposing some existing standard rather than going and reinventing the wheel.
Mary Sarah, one of the things that I've certainly been sort of focused on here is that oftentimes in the healthcare conversation, it hasn't been a recognition of other standards. So, right. And that's, you know, I've had to get on my soapbox a couple times and just, you know, I actually did it in the executive committee at the Gravity the other day to say, look, yes, HL7 goes, you know, this far, but we got to recognize that there's other major SDO. Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. So that's the reason for articulating that.
And the important thing to know is that I'm not a FHIR fanatic at all. I just want to make use of something that already exists when it's suitable for purpose. And you'll also find me at the moment advocating for the use of direct secure messaging from Direct Trust for some referrals, because if you're going to do a SNAP application, you really don't need to have a restful interaction to do it. You're not going to hear back for 2, 3, 4 weeks anyway.
All right.
So thank you for that. That's I learn so much every time. So Dwayne, to your point, we'll stay tuned for the meeting. I don't know when this is going to be. It'll be either on, there's 2 half days, as I said, September 10th and September 17th from 10 to 5. We're going to hopefully in the next day or two figure out what that looks like and when that will be. And then we'll coordinate the logistics around those kind of conversations and hopefully get more conversations. And Mary Sarah, if you're available, I don't think she just dropped off. We'll also recruit some other folks to help moderate this conversation who are familiar with the various different standards and approaches. So with that, any last comments for folks?
I have a question about the consent scan. Is the legal information that was aggregated, is that also been shared in the emails so it can be referenced?
What do you mean shared in the emails?
So I mean, just I know that it's a separate document, right? It's
I see.
It's an
Yeah,
Excel document that that has not been kind of integrated within the larger Google Doc.
and now I know what you're talking about. I don't know. It hasn't yet been integrated, and I don't think it has yet been shared. I think the people working on it are looking at it. I think it will be shared. It can be shared, but it is not yet.
Okay. I was thinking about doing some work on the Word document. Wasn't sure, like, I wasn't going to be tweaking the legal document, but it'd be interesting to know what's been done already, just in case it could inform what's going on.
Send me, Matt, send me an email. I want to get a look at it as well anyway, so I don't see a problem at all.
All right. Great.
Super. Any other comments, thoughts?
I just want to point out to everyone that Daniel said that with their 2 half days from 10 to 7, Daniel thinks that 10 to 5, 10 to 5 is a half day, just to be clear.
Good catch, Adam. All right.
A great meeting, and thank you, Jim.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
You.
Okay, see you all next week, and we'll be in touch beforehand. And again, if you want to participate, let us know.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.